I will now say more about the internal landscape. In a psychoanalytic view, people imaginatively and unconsciously create an internal world within the psyche, one peopled with figures that psychoanalysis calls internal objects. The term object is rather impersonal, but psychoanalysis uses it so as not to restrict its scope. This is important. An internal object can be a plant or an animal or parents or an abstract idea or classmates or the collective leadership at Copenhagen, whatever. It is anything that the self forms a relationship with, and it has a personal history as well as a social one in chains of association of meaning. The self, as well as the other, is imaginatively constructed the self, as well as the other, is imaginatively constructed as an internal object. And internal objects are not simply the inner representation of the outside world. Crucially, they are also the outside world internalized and then distorted by unconscious fantasy that's brought to bear on them. So it's that mixture of the two. The self, to make matters complicated even more, is not a unitary concept within psychoanalysis. There are part selves, each with their own identities, each with their own sense of inner entitlement and wish to carry on being, and often these part selves are in conflict. All these part selves are internal objects, and a person's character and sense of identity may be an expression of which of these part selves is habitually dominant within the psyche. In a previous paper, I drew a distinction between two part selves, one with a sense of lively entitlement to engage with reality and a lively appetite, and a self that feels entitled in a more narcissistic way to idealized endless provision. And here, in this paper, I suggest that these two parts of the self operate as well in different internal landscapes. Because landscape is also part of the internal world, and by landscape, I mean place in the internal world of the psyche. Internal landscapes are the imaginative, I suggest, psychic locations of the different sets of relationships we imagine between ourselves and various others. We construct many different sorts of internal landscape. They are not easy to think about, and they may be largely unconscious. They are the psychic imaginary places in which we relate to our families, to our friends, to our social groups, to society, to democracy, to politics, to the marketplace, to nature, and so on. We also relate to different aspects of ourselves within our psychic landscapes. Our landscapes are our settings. They are socially determined to a considerable degree, and we express and also develop different aspects of our identity within these settings. We find ourselves already placed in landscapes. We find ourselves in landscapes, and we find ourselves in landscapes. And I think one of the central points I want to make, and it actually relates to the point about impoverishment, is that diversity of landscape, these inner landscapes, diversity of landscape is vital to forming an identity sufficiently rich to promote well-being and the feeling of being alive as a person. I suggest that a rich and elaborated sense of self depends on feeling at home within one's different landscapes, and that's an extra concept. One has to feel, not only have a landscape, but feel at home in it. And by at home, I mean feeling safe and attached, and this comes from the sense that there is in the background a mindful authority that one can depend on. A mindful presence looks after us, values and respects us in an ongoing way, and this builds a sense of continuity through which these narratives of self in various landscapes can develop. Our hearts, our minds, and our hearts and minds and something, will develop through identifying with a mindful presence. I do want. Our hearts, our minds, and what I want to say is our will develop through identifying with a mindful presence. I will now explore some ways that capitalism, in its current deregulated form, works like the big bad wolf in the fairy story to attack the psychic home, where we feel safe enough to explore our varied sets of relationships. Here, the solid containing home with its hearth stands for the internal psychic home and internal mindedness. In a previous paper, I discussed runaway greed and its links with an arrogant state of mind, one that says, I'm entitled to arrogate to myself everything I crave. Why? Because I'm superior and special in an unquestioning sort of way. And I looked at the way this ordinary and everyday consumerist mindset is based on a particular form of splitting and identification. It's been referred to this idea a number of times in the conference. The splitting is into superior idealized in-groups and inferior out-groups, and the identification is with the superior in-group. I explored the way in which corporate big business appeals to our wish to feel special and superior, and how the increased consumerism this is currently leading to is significantly driving global warming. Now, when we split and become identified with a position of entitlement to exploit without concern, we not only split ourselves, but we also split our internal landscapes by rearranging the sense of space between ourselves and the other. For example, when a natural landscape, including common ground for concern between internal objects, becomes split into superior and inferior, there are various consequences. Concern becomes something we show for those we assign to out-groups kept near us in our imagination. So I'll say it again. Concern becomes something we only show for those we assign to our in-groups kept near us in our imagination, while those objects we assign to being far away from us we can more easily treat without concern. And this is a kind of spatial arrangement, actually. In the imagination. Internal objects kept far away can be parts of ourselves as well, and even our own children. Spatially, the faraway objects can be experienced as in the shadows or forgotten about, or spatially placed in a far-off land, which can also be called the future. When we split the other, we also split the self, and in addition, we split our internal landscapes. In a split inner landscape, the lively self may be kept isolated and unloved in a faraway psychic location, and the arrogant internal self may be kept actually even so close that we can't recognize it. The arrogant self needs to, that's the consuming, arrogating self, needs to protect itself from feeling touched by feelings of love and concern in order to continue to exploit without guilt, shame, or anxiety. And I suggest that keeping the good loved object on the other side of a divide through prejudice is a very effective means of achieving protection from love. The result of this splitting and this identification with an idealized self is actually being exiled from a psychic home which is set in landscapes of struggle to relate truthfully to the other and the self with respect and concern. Capitalism, to secure its profit, is necessarily interested in stimulating the avaricious side of our natures, as it is avarice that drives consumption, expressing itself in everyday mindsets. It promotes a culture of splitting, and it also seeks to attack and weaken the reality-based and concerned part of the self that seeks to reduce splitting and restore a more integrated, albeit conflicted, sense of self, and restore common ground between self and other. My focus is particularly on capitalism when deregulated. Detailed recent work on American corporate capitalism in its current deregulated global phase reveals certain key points. First, it has become distinctly more predatory and intrusive in the ways that it seeks to influence identity. Secondly, the evidence is that affluence does not lead to human flourishing and well-being, but is linked with increased levels of depression, addictions, and disorders of attention in society. A third point is that it is just not true that capitalism sees people as basically self-interested and greedy and simply caters for them. This is the view it generally offers to people, including its own employees. But in fact, capitalism understands that people are also naturally empathetic, concerned, and inherently moral beings with love and respect for nature and also their fellow beings, both human and animal. It knows that billions need to be spent to persuade them otherwise. In its own language of advertising, it seeks to influence identity through what it calls, in its own language, Mindshare. Fourthly, and importantly, a point that's already been raised actually, not in this form, but capitalism could not achieve mindshare without the active, ongoing, and also knowing participation of the psychological sciences. And I include psychology, and at another level I include psychoanalysis as well, through the huge influence that analytic ideas has had, and our relative silence. A psychoanalytic perspective would not ignore the importance of material status, especially in the eyes of others, as an important part of self-esteem. We all like to be up with the Joneses. But we would see this as insufficient for well-being. And well-being would depend on such factors as being in touch with a moral sense, the capacity to experience feelings, and the struggle to face reality as truthfully as possible, external reality, but also the inner reality of our own human natures. In a psychoanalytic view, well-being is also linked with the creative expressions of diverse aspects of identity. From a cultural perspective, our love of nature has already been quite extensively colonized by capitalism, and I suggest one sign of this colonization is evidence of splitting. Nature lovers within marketing discourse tend to comprise an in-group and an out-group. The in-group are consumers of products such as fancy bikes, new-style walking poles, binoculars, and exotic travel. And this group is appealed to and represented as ideally good. The out-group is that group who more successfully resist colonization and seek experiences that feed their sense of being alive in nature. Capitalist culture tends to see this group as ideally bad, in other words, as demonized or ridiculed. And in this view, nature lovers may be seen as mentally unstable or quirky, the beards and sandals brigade, twitchers, hermits, terrorists, and so on. An ordinary, everyday, personal example of living within this split environment of ours is my decision to wear my horse riding hat as a cycling helmet to avoid buying a new one and add to waste. I get some stares on the street. The situation here, I think, is very complex. Am I just getting up on my high horse in this hat, thinking I'm superior to others that I see as following a consumerist herd? Is this a way for me to avoid my own envy of people? And John Keane, you mentioned envy this morning. I think it's a very important issue. So is this just a way for me to avoid my own envy of people with more money than me? Here, after all, I can spend less and feel potentially superior to those with more. Am I wearing a hair shirt along with my riding hat? If my riding hat is a green statement, just what sort of a green statement is it? How much am I green with ecology, green with envy, or just plain naivety in trying to insulate myself from social pressures, from the power of the marketplace, and also from becoming more split in my thinking myself? Being subjected to splitting by outside forces is not easy to resist. The danger is that one may begin to counter arguments already polarized by becoming more polarized oneself. In my riding hat example, it would be too black and white if I focused just on the question of social pressure to fit in with consumerist trends, because in so doing, I would ignore important parts of my local social reality. My hat has attracted some stares, and I have felt a bit of an outsider, but I've also encountered friendly nods, smiles, and a wave from the local Bobby on the beat who hailed me good morning. But my point is, that the human tendency to split into superior and inferior and to rapidly identify with the superior, while something encouraged and imposed on us by outside forces also meets our own internal objects. Splitting and idealization as mechanisms are an integral part of our inner psychic lives, and the psychic work needed to repair a depressive, more caring identity within more integrated and tolerant inner landscapes is ongoing in life. Capitalism does tolerate us developing and living in our elaborated creative landscapes, I suggest, but only up to a point. When our reality sense mounts a challenge that threatens our identities as consumers and consumerist consumers, capitalism may try to damage and intimidate the reality-based mindful part of us. And having placed, for just one example here, I've chosen a recent development in certain nature programs, hoping that this is not just my personal obsession, but that it will be recognizable to people. Okay. There have been big changes in many nature programs over the last 10 years, I think. I exclude many programs, of course, like the BBC Natural World Series, and of course I exclude David Attenborough. in these sorts of programs I'm talking about, space for the erotic, the loving relationship with nature is eroded, and space for the erotized is expanded. Erotization is where power over the object is dominant, and where power, not love and mutuality, is the turn-on. Sex, aggression, and danger tend to dominate as themes in these programs. Nature is arrogated, and the viewer is encouraged to identify with this arrogating attitude. What is meant to be awesome and wonderful in these programs is not nature, but the narrator, I suggest. The wildlife filmmaker Amanda Barrett said, when asked about it, "I don't listen to music when I'm in the wild, I listen to the sounds that are there." In the kind of programs I am discussing, the sounds of nature tend to be seen as boring and in need of some sexing up. I suggest music and sound, an essential feature of these kinds of nature programs, can be used to blunt feelings, stop thinking, and undermine the will. The current trend is towards the use of sometimes crass anthropomorphizing and narrator-grandized mood music. The result is a reduction of space in which to tolerate our state of not knowing, and for granting the full respect due to other species of their otherness. This is important, as appreciation of otherness provides checks to our more greedy and possessive tendencies. It checks our omniscience. Until we know that we do not know the other and that the other moves in its own ways, not dictated by us, we cannot begin to know the other. The music also tends increasingly to be pumped up in volume. I hope everyone's recognizing what I'm talking about. I'm not just talking to myself here. Also, the use of sudden, loud, flash banging noises is also more frequent in these programs and generally across the board in many films and TV programs involving narrative. It is a kind of cutting whoosh that I can't find a word for, but it's like whoosh, something comes in. Aware that I'm being highly speculative, I nevertheless see some of these flash bangs as potentially representing an object feeling entitled or driven to attempt to split the mind by using a wall of sound. In effect, in these moments, the effect in these moments is to keep genuine experience of contact with the other in a faraway place. In addition to the use of sudden flashes of sound is an increased use of sudden, shocking, whooshed-in visual material, unannounced, and, I suggest, because unannounced, intrusive. It often involves bloody violence to the body. I suggest these are visual assaults, and they may place the viewer wanting to preserve the integrity of their inner psychic home in a no-win kind of situation, because either the viewer protects him or herself by numbing their feelings, or the viewer may experience feelings of helplessness that may be traumatic to the meaning and continuity-seeking part of the self. Either way, they disrupt the narrative of relating to the other, and I suggest they undermine the human will to connect with the other. The justification for these kinds of recent changes that have appeared across the board in TV programming and in cinema, particularly within the Hollywood tradition, is that they just provide people with what they want. I think it is far more complex and involves industry-driven ways to promote identification and idealized, cruelly indifferent and exploiting human hero figures, and to attack, assault, and maltreat the lively parts of the self that resist this. Difficulties in forming a coherent personal narrative have been shown to be a feature of insecure attachments. I suggest these messages, by promoting identification with arrogance, break up the continuity of being at home in a mindful way, and as such are destructive to narrative and to our sense of coherence. I think the increased use of these tactics may well constitute the trickle down into general culture in diluted form of the strategy of shock and awe explicitly described by neocon strategists and used under the Bush administration. There is nothing new about shock and awe as a potent form of persuasion. Naomi Klein outlined its key elements in her recent book, The Shock Doctrine. I'm not going to go into it, but it's very interesting. She describes the whole process of how it happens. We know that when people feel traumatized, they are less able to think, and their will for action is sapped. They are also more likely to identify with the aggressor. I suggest that measures I have described are particularly effective in deadening more concerned, depressive feelings and promoting a blank state of mind, one that blanks the here and now of reality and seeks to replace it with the pumped up, self-aggrandized, here and now state of the dream world.
I've got no psychological training either. My own academic background is in environmental philosophy, particularly the ethics and political theory of issues around ecological sustainability. And those issues challenge traditional ethics in many ways. Firstly, of course, traditional ethics is very much concerned with interhuman interactions and in the present day interactions as well. Usually our obligations to the future are not well covered in their historical ethical traditions. And they also tend to presuppose stable functional societies, and arguably none of those conditions are currently in play. So I personally feel that the most promising and flexible approaches are out of the range of possible ethical approaches tend to be those coming from a virtue ethics tradition, which focus on the not on the outcomes as a utilitarian tradition would, but on the characteristics of the agent. The question of the right thing to do is connected with the question of what kind of person do I want to be, what are the relevant virtues, the relevant excellences of character in the jargon which I need to embody in this situation. And it seems to me that these questions must be surely somehow connected with whatever psychoanalysis has got to say about what a healthy and well-functioning person is and the kinds of things that they do and say and get up to. And that's why it's so exciting to kind of be here and interact with this. So Sally described how we as individuals are encouraged to identify with the runaway corporate greed by which our society is led, and in so doing to become greedy ourselves. And greed was defined as arrogant, unlimited consumption, encouraged by inculcating a sense of entitlement through membership of an in-group. And of course this may prove ecologically disastrous, but even if that wasn't the case, even if we had unlimited resources and a stable climate, greed would still be bad for us, and consumerism would still be have a corrosive effect on our minds and our hearts. This is not only because of the fact that affluence doesn't seem to make us happier beyond a certain point, as we've already heard discussed, but also because a greedy person is, in at least one important respect, not what we would call a flourishing person. So what would an ungreedy person be like? And virtue ethics approaches the question by identifying greed as a vice, as opposite of a virtue, to be contrasted with the relevant virtues which we identify as proper relationships with possessions, consumption, affluence, and so forth. Understanding what constitutes a proper relationship with possessions or consumption requires, in turn, working out just how these do contribute to a flourishing human life. This is not necessarily to recommend a hair-shirt approach, because in the virtue ethics theory, which you'll be happy to hear I'm not going to go into, we're sort of seeking a virtuous mean between vices of excess on the one hand and vices of deficiency on the other. So in greed in that framework would be bounded by some sort of self-denial at one end and some sort of, the excessive arrogance and unlimited consumption on the other. And hopefully there's some sort of congruence between that and the sort of psychoanalytic picture. The same sort of analysis can be applied piecemeal, and is in the literature, to other environmental vices such as envy or profligacy, in an attempt to identify and encourage corresponding virtues of character. It can also be applied in a more overarching way to the idea of human relationships with the non-human world per se, those relationships. This version of environmental virtue ethics seeks to identify and encourage relationships which exemplify what a philosopher called Rosalind Hursthouse has called the virtue of right orientation to nature. And these would be relationships which contribute both to human flourishing and to ecological sustainability. Capitalism, however, as we've heard, does exactly the opposite. In pursuit of profit and growth, it stimulates greed and other environmental vices by, as Sally puts it, encouraging to split our inner landscapes, which I find that a very rich and fascinating way of looking at it. And to split our landscapes and ourselves in two, and so then we have to protect ourselves from truly loving the non-human, which would be painful once we've become identified with the arrogant aggressor who destroys it. She also explained how genuine love accepts both lover and beloved as flawed rather than idealising the other. And capitalism seeks to warp all our emotions, doesn't it? And in this context, it's trying to warp our loving feelings towards nature into idealisation and then colonise and co-opt them in order to sell us things and ensure its own survival. Consumers is encouraged to seek eternal youth, to accept no limits to personal wealth or economic growth, to claim their right to live life as an endless fantasy. An idealised nature, cleanly repackaged into a standardised consumable product, fits perfectly into this virtual hyper-reality. The inert product is loved like a chocolate bar, not like a lover. This seems wrong, but is there a right way? How should we love nature? I've got a section here that I'm going to skip a bit because I'm talking about how environmental philosophers have also approached this idea of loving nature as other than us, or as part of us, ourselves as part of nature or as apart from nature. And deep ecologists and holists kind of stress the continuity, and people on the other side of the debate stress the necessity of respecting nature's otherness and its quality of what Simon Hale would call not usness. Though that whole complex of issues is quite knotted and complicated, and I think the psychoanalytic perspective is really helpful in illuminating that. Environmental ethicists and aestheticians have also discussed how, and indeed whether, environmental science and ecological knowledge really helps us appreciate nature, or sometimes can it sometimes get in the way. Does an ecologist who really knows a landscape find themselves in a better position to love it, or or not? I don't presume to offer any answer to that question, but just to say that we have heard about children and how they love nature, and sometimes in different ways to adults. And one relevant emotion, which we've looked at a lot in environmental ethics and aesthetics, is the emotion of wonder. But not all experiences of nature are wonderful or even pleasant. We've heard a bit about the role of experiences of nature in helping us come to terms with death and grieving and our own mortality and physicality. Perhaps these shock and awe techniques of desensitisation that we see in current marketing and marketisation of nature are just the current cutting edge of the science of persuasion, having been proven in military contexts. They're effective because they distort how we relate to the world. I recently heard Tim Kasser speak and asked him afterwards why he focuses so much on advertising to children. And he said, well, it's a tactical thing because he thinks that's a winnable battle, that they're just as corrosive of adults' minds. But one positive point to make there is that if policymakers are looking for an effective place to intervene in the cycle of overproduction, overconsumption, ecological damage, then this is probably it. Restrictions on marketing, broadly construed, are surely going to be among the most effective climate change mitigation measures available. It would also be good for our own physical and mental health, of course. So finally, a word about the political legitimacy of such interventions. Liberal politics that legitimises consumer capitalism does so largely by appeal to a false ideal of neutrality between conceptions of the good life. The role of the state is simply seen as ensuring that all are free to pursue happiness in their own chosen way, but this conception of politics inevitably imposes unexamined conceptions of a good life and of freedom. And under capitalism, of course, we don't choose our conceptions of a good life freely. We're aggressively conditioned into the idea that fulfilment comes through consumption. So escaping our ecological predicament is going to require not only changes in our physical practices, but also a reconfiguration of politics around some kind of commitment to honest reflection and debate about just what a flourishing human life really consists of. And such politics might even help us achieve what Sally has called mindful government.
I feel real trepidation at doing so because I'm not a psychoanalyst. I don't even have any psychology training. And so I think I'm going to really struggle to engage with Sally's paper at the level of depth that it invites and demands. So if I can contribute anything, I suppose it's as somebody who works for an environmental organisation which is daily confronted with the challenges of campaigning and communicating on the environmental crisis generally and climate change specifically. So it's with that in mind that I'm just going to offer a few brief and I hope not too naive reflections on what the material Sally's provided us with. And the first of those is that I found it really clear that the work she presented, there are strong parallels between that and the results of some of the empirical work, particularly in social psychology. I've been working with Tim Kasser a lot, who I think presented a little film that you saw earlier on. And it's clear, for example, from the social psychology, that the extent to which people feel themselves to be part of nature, to the extent they feel themselves to be part of nature, it seems they're more likely to express both pro-environmental attitudes and indeed engage in pro-environmental behaviour. But Sally's paper prompted me to think a bit harder about love for nature, and in particular whether, in talking about love for nature, we mean love for other, I think was Sally's phrase, or love for nature as part of us. And the social psychology studies seem to suggest that connection to nature is tested both through explicit surveys, so asking people how connected they feel to nature, and implicit approaches, attempts to actually assess at an unconscious level how connected people feel. Both point to the idea that a stronger connection to nature is likely to lead to expressions of greater concern about environmental problems, and greater motivation to engage in pro-environmental behaviours. But are connection to nature and love of nature the same thing? If love of nature increases with a person's sense of connection to nature, is this essentially reflecting a love of self, but now, of course, an enlarged self, which includes not just me and other people, but nature more widely? And what are the implications of love of nature as love of something that is other? And I think these are questions which are of really important practical significance for the work of environmental campaigners and communicators. Much of the conservation discourse in particular, I think, perhaps is more conspicuous in the case of debate within the conservation movement than even within the environmental movement, stresses the otherness of nature as something that must be, nature is something that must be conserved out there and that's threatened as something different from us. So we speak of the human impacts on nature. And I'm reminded in microcosm of this by, I lived until recently in Bristol, where the harbour side is aligned with these signs urging people not to feed for gulls on the basis that we should let nature look after itself. And underscoring for me the practical decisions that we have to make in terms of communicating around environmental challenges, about the extent to which we see it as being something out there that we cherish and wish to conserve or protect because of a love of it as other, or on the other hand as something which includes us. Some campaigning approaches, or at least environmental, I suppose campaigning conveys something rather too specific. Some approaches that environmental organisations are taking, I think, are beginning, albeit quite hesitantly, to engage those issues. WWF Scotland, for example, recently ran a process that it called Natural Change, where they took a number of young Scottish leaders and gave them a wilderness experience up on Knoydart as part of a wider inquiry into their relationship to one another and the natural environment. And that involves psychotherapists. And there's no doubt that the consequences of those approaches, as reported by the participants, were really positive. But Tim Kasser would remind us, I think, that, well, that's all well and good, but it's analogous perhaps to taking a child who's living in an abusive context at home, maybe has an alcoholic mother or an abusive father, putting him in an hour's counselling once a week, making him feel a lot better in the course of that hour, but then knowing, the counsellor knowing throughout that hour that the kid's going to go back into the same context afterwards. The analogy there with taking people out of their normal cultural context into a wilderness experience, knowing that the experiences they have may be rapidly, are going to encounter the onslaught of mass culture outside and may be rapidly eroded as a result. And bound up with this, I think, is the question of to what extent we see other people as part of nature, which is something that Sally doesn't say an awful lot about. But isn't an inner city bar on a Saturday night every bit as much as part of nature as an oak wood? And perhaps failing to see this entails failing to stress the importance of feeling love towards nature, whilst overlooking the perhaps prior need to become connected to one's society and to love one's fellow humans as a prior condition to that. And that's again borne out by the social psychology, in that people's concern about environmental challenges and their willingness to engage in pro-environmental behaviour seems to be closely aligned to their concern about social challenges and their willingness to engage in behaviour in line with that, supposedly because both those concerns and sets of behaviours are rooted in a common set of values around concern for others, an altruism, a benevolence, or a universalism. And so I think it's dangerous, perhaps, to ignore that. It's dangerous, I think, politically, because it plays into the hands of those who portray environmentalists as largely indifferent to human suffering, and who hold a callous indifference to the impact of environmental conservation policy on people, sort of a charge of eco-fascism. But I think it's also dangerous practically, because the evidence is that the values, as I've said, underpinning people's sense of connection to other people and their altruism are precisely those same values which underpin concern for non-human nature. So it may be that approaches to environmentalism or conservation which depreciate the importance of people's sense of connection to other people may actually be counterproductive, undermining concern about non-human nature. And conversely, of course, activities that strengthen concern for other people are likely to strengthen public concern for the environment. So this is where humanitarian, environmental and animal rights groups, to name but three, might find common cause in asking what factors currently serve to suppress intrinsic values, such as connection to nature and willingness to help others without asking it for anything in return, and conversely asking what factors help to activate and strengthen those values culturally. Now, Sally touches on some of the crucial ways in which we might begin to engage at a cultural level. For example, and the ways in which extrinsic values currently strengthen, for example, through immersion in political discourse that stresses the preeminence of economic growth as the ultimate policy concern, or through exposure to some 1,600 advertisements, according to some estimates that the average UK adult sees every day. And Sally looks to mindful leadership to begin to address root causes of the cultural dominance of those extrinsic values. And of course, such leadership is necessary. Also, it seems unlikely to be delivered without a great deal of assistance. And we know only too well how conviction politicians become muted when in power and how a vice-like hold of vested interests ensures the current hegemony limps on. The birth of mindful leadership will require the midwifery of an active and committed citizenry, and it's here that I believe there's a crucial role for the third sector. If voluntary organisations could come to situate their issue-specific preoccupations on a broader canvas and come to understand the common cause of promoting those aspects of identity that underpin public appetite for pro-social and pro-environmental change, which are of crucial importance to them all, then a great deal may be possible. That might start, for example, with a concerted campaign on advertising, particularly perhaps advertising to children. So I think that strengthening love of nature is crucially important, and as much that the environmental movement must learn from psychotherapists and the type of treatment that Sally's just presented to us. But I suggest that we should go further and recognise that urging love for nature is not enough, and that such calls, even from the environmental movement itself, must be situated in a wider and more deliberate approach to urging greater love per se. Thank you.